I played a blitz game recently. I was white. My opponent played the French defense. Sooner or later I will learn all the theory behind all the different variations, but for now my go-to move is c4. If black continues with the normal French move d5, then I like to play c takes d5 and open up the position. Most French players are not expecting to play an open position. But my opponent responded with c5. After c5, the game is really a Sicilian defense with these pawns on e4 and c5. With the white pawn on c4 as well, that's like having a Marazzi bind in the Sicilian. So we continue to develop. He played a6, a little slow. Maybe he wanted to keep my knight off of b5. I pushed d4, so now we're playing an open Sicilian, having traded the pawns on d4 with a Marazzi bind. Okay, bishop b4, pinning my knight. Bishop b3, knight e7, knight ge7, bishop e2, continuing to develop, castles, castles, and then my opponent plays knight e5. Maybe not a great move considering the response f4, because now I think the knight should go back to where it was. My opponent played it to the only other space it can go to, g6, and one of the problems with that move is, well, that's where the other knight was headed. So we're now blocking one of the developing squares for the other knight. Okay, I played queen c2. My opponent played f5, and I decided to trade on f5, try to open up the position. I'm very well developed here. The only piece that's not playing a good role is this a1 rook, but my opponent still has to develop his queen side. So I trade pawns on f5. My opponent responds by taking with the knight. Maybe more solid was taking with the pawn and keeping this blocked up on the f-file. But he takes with the knight. I take with the knight, and again, maybe taking with the pawn would be better than my opponent's move, rook takes f5. Okay, after rook takes f5, I can redeploy my bishop to d3 to harass the rook. It's on a better diagonal now, making a battery with my queen. And the rook should drop all the way back to f8, because after my opponent's move, rook to f6, I was able to post my knight aggressively in the center of the board and attack the rook. So then it dropped back to f8. I took a breather to attack his bishop, maybe expand on the queen side. Bishop e7, knight g3, maybe that's a little passive. I think the engine recommended knight g5 in this position. And if takes, then I like to have the open rook file here. I have two rooks that can get into play quickly, and his other rook is stuck. So knight to g5 would be more aggressive. It also comes with a threat. For example, if we make some non-move, the threat is knight takes h7, because if it captures, then we get this knight with check. So I like that move, knight g5. I didn't see it. I played knight g3 to open up my bishop, so I have a battery here. I'm threatening to win a pawn by taking on g6. Okay, my opponent guarded g6 with his queen. And then I got my queen's rook into the game, rook a d1, putting it on a half open file. And now my opponent is very desperate to develop his queen side. He has to get this bishop out and get that rook into play. The engine suggested moving d7 and modestly developing the bishop here, but instead my opponent decided to sack a pawn by playing b5. Okay, and there's not too much to criticize there, since you've got to get these pieces out quickly. Can't move it to b6 without losing the pawn either. But b5 is a pawn sack after c takes b5. C takes b5, bishop takes b5. Now I actually had a way to win the exchange after b5 too. Instead of winning a pawn, I could have played bishop to e4, hitting the rook in the corner. Got these two bishops pointing in this direction. The only the only move to save the rook is to b8, but then bishop to a7 is going to win the exchange. Okay, but I do like my position after winning this pawn. I'm still better developed. My bishops are very active in this position, so I should be winning. And now my opponent makes a blunder, bishop a6. He was so intent on developing this bishop, he forgot about this square right here, which is double attacked. So bishop takes d7, threatening the queen. The queen moves to f7. And after the queen moved to f7, I'm looking at this pawn, and if I take it, I've got his queen pinned to his king. But I need another piece to attack that square. So I decided to play rook f e1, and then to get this bishop out of the way, so then I would be threatening bishop takes e6, winning the queen. But I had a much better move in this position. The engine suggested queen to e4, because that immediately attacks it. It's faster, and there's no way to guard this pawn in this position. So I think the best move is putting the king in the corner, actually. All right, but I played the slower rook f e1, and then bishop h4. Not too much point in that, pinning my knight perhaps. And now I play bishop f2, following through with my plan, getting the bishop off of that file to hit that e6 pawn. I did have a better move here too as well. I didn't see this. The engine suggests f5, and this has a double threat. This is another way to immediately attack that pawn on e6. So I'm threatening bishop takes e6, winning the queen, and I'm also threatening the knight. And this is kind of devastating. Okay, so that would have been stronger. But I played my bishop back to f2, and then he has to save his queen, so he decides to take the f-pawn. But now his queen is kind of vulnerable sitting there, and I redeploy some of my pieces while attacking his queen. First I take the pawn and push his king to the corner, and then I play rook to e4. Okay, he drops the queen back to f6. Probably not the best place to move it. Probably needed to retreat it along this diagonal somewhere. I guess all the way back to b8. Because this allowed me bishop d4, attacking the queen again, putting the bishop on a more aggressive diagonal pointed right at his king. Then queen g5 allowed me another aggressive move, rook g4, hitting the queen again and point it right down this file. And there's really no good defense in this position. He has to move the queen away somewhere, and after he moved it to b5, my position just looked so overwhelming to me that I took my time and found an excellent tactic. Okay, maybe pause the video and try to find White's best move. Okay, best move here that I played was queen takes g6, sacking the queen. And the point is he can't take it because rook takes h4, check, and that square's covered. So the only legal response is queen to h5, and then we take it, and we have an overwhelming material advantage, and we're still in the middle of a mating attack. So it can't take my queen after queen takes g6. But I'm also threatening a mate on g7, and I've got the rook and the bishop pointed at g7 as well. So there really is no defense at this point. My opponent tried bishop to f6 to guard that square and also to block my bishop's access. But then I had a nice cute mate in 2, and I suppose you can see the moves over here, so I won't tell you to pause your video again. But the mate in 2 was queen takes g7 check, forcing bishop takes g7, and then bishop takes g7 mate. So sacking my queen twice in one game. So I was happy with that game overall. I had very fast development, good piece play. My opponent's queenside rook and bishop never got into the game, and that's pretty much why he lost. All right, thanks for watching the video.